Hi, in this tutorial we're going to look at how to load views. For example, we have a screen here that has multiple buttons on here, and we're going to set it up so that when you tap a button it's going to load a different view, and then we're going to be able to tap a button to go back to our home screen. So this requires adding additional view controllers, which we're going to look at. So to get started, we're going to create a new project in Xcode. So for my new project, I'm going to start with a single view application. Even though we eventually want to have more than one view, we're going to start with the initial single view and then add views as we need them. So single view application, click Next. I'm going to give it a name, and I'm just going to call this, since my images are constellations, I'm going to call this Constellations. And I'm not going to have anything checked down here, so we're going to handle our own memory management. So I'll click Next and save my project files. Okay, we start out with our ViewController header implementation file and a ViewController nib file. And I'm going to drag over some images to use for this example. I'm going to drag these into the supporting files folder. I'm going to make sure copy items is checked off and click finish. So now I have a series of images here for my main screen. Okay, next I'm going to go into the ViewController nib file, and I'm going to set up my main interface. And so with this, it's just going to be a black background. I'm going to add a label top. I'm going to call it the Constellations, and I'm going to center that text. Next, for my images, I'm going to use those as buttons. So this is a way that you can make a custom button. I'm going to start with a round rect button and drag it onto my screen. And I'm going to change my image over here, and I'm going to start with Aquarius. Now it's a little distorted, so I'm going to change the mode from scale to fill to aspect fit. And then I'm going to drag this out a little bit so it fits in here better. And other times, if you have an image that has some transparency around the edge, instead of a round rect type, you can change it to custom, and it will take away any part of the remaining button that would be there from the round rect. So I'm just going to change this to custom, but it doesn't really have any effect on here. I could add another round rectangle button and add my image there. You can also duplicate buttons and other elements on your interface screen by holding down the Option key and clicking and dragging. So I'm going to do that in this example. I'm just going to hold down the Option key and drag and line this up. And I'm going to hold down the Option key again and drag out another version. And then once I have those set up, I can select all of those, and I'm going to hold down the Option key again and drag out a copy of those and keep them lined up. And I'm going to repeat that because I have 12 all together. And now that I have all of my buttons on here, all I need to do is go in and change the images on each of these. Okay, so for this demonstration, I'm only going to do the first 3 buttons. I'm not going to create views for all of these other ones because it would be a long video and it would get pretty repetitive. You can also see on our interface we have 12 buttons, and in our objects view we have button, 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 button. And so it gets kind of hard to tell one button from another. If you click on it here, you can see it becomes selected. One way to help you identify or distinguish one button from another in this view is if you select it and give it a title over on the Attributes panel. So I could call this Aquarius. And then you can see over here that now this particular one is identified, and I could easily go in and pick out the button based on its title. And you could also get that value. You could get the title for a current button that had been clicked through the sender information. Okay, next, what we want our buttons to do is when they're clicked, we want them to do something. So we need to connect that to an action. So I'm going to close the utility panel, and I'm going to open up the Assistant Editor, and it should open up the ViewController.h file. And now I'm going to create an action with, I'm going to pick this first button, I'm going to right click and drag from it into my header file and change the connection type to an action. And let's say we'll call this Go Stars. Now we want the other buttons to really do the same method. We're going to create one method. That would be one technique. You could do 12 different methods. You could connect one to an Aquarius method, another one to an Aries method, another one to Cancer method. But in my example, I'm just going to have one method that's going to handle all of these. So for each of these other buttons, you can right click and drag and connect it to the same method or the same action. So I'll do that. I'm just going to do that for these three, but you would continue on with any other ones that you had. So now when I hover over this circle, you can see that those three buttons are connected to this action. Okay, so next, let's set this up so that our first button for Aquarius will open up another view that is set up for Aquarius. So again, in our example, right, when we tap the Aquarius button, it opens up a separate view with information just for Aquarius. So we need to create this screen or this view. And to do that, I'm going to come over to my folder view. Now I can right click here and go to New File. Another method is to go to File on the menu and choose New File. Both of them will take you to the same place. Under the iOS option, we want to choose Cocoa Touch, and we're going to choose an Objective-C class. Now this is a recent change in Xcode 4.3.3. Previously, there was an option here for a UI ViewController subclass. So that is not available anymore in Cocoa Touch options. So you can just choose an Objective-C class and click Next, and we're going to give our class a name. So since we're going to have one for potentially each of the different constellations, I'm going to name my class by the constellation name. It'll be easier to keep track of. So I'm going to call this one Aquarius. And you want to make sure that it's a subclass of the UI ViewController, right? The one that we get as a default when we create a new project is a ViewController subclass. We're not working with iPad right now, so I'll leave that unchecked. And we do want a nib file for our user interface, since this is not set up using storyboards. So we'll click Next. Now it's asking you where do you want to save the files, and of course we're going to put it into our project files. And we'll click Create. And then if you notice in your file panel over to the side, we have three new files. There's a header, an implementation file, and then a nib file. So these are all the ones that are going to control this new view. Now it put it under supporting files, which is okay, but I'm just going to click and drag it up to my project folder name so that it's in with all of my other class files, just to be able to keep things more organized. Okay, so it defaults to show me the nib file here, and I'm going to, while this is open, I'm going to set this nib file up. So I'm going to go out of the Assistant Editor and open up my Utility panel, and I'm just going to change the background color and do some setup in here. So I'm going to put a label up here, and we'll say the name of this is Aquarius. I'm going to put on a round rectangle button that we're going to use to go back to the home screen. Next I'm going to add an image view in here. I'm going to put in my little Aquarius stamp image, and then a text view. Right, we have a multiple line text view here, so this would potentially have the content for this particular constellation. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time working with the layout on here. You'll be able to get the idea from that. So we'll be able to tell from this when we have navigated from our home screen to a different view controller. Now that we have our view set up, let's go in and set up our view controller so that when the button is clicked, it will display this view. So we added these, the header files and the nib file, but our view controller file doesn't know about this, so we have to go in and tell it. So I'm going to go into the ViewController header file, and we're going to import in the header file for our Aquarius ViewController. And so by importing it, we're saying, okay, here's some stuff that you're going to need to know in order to do your job. And we also need to create an instance of the ViewController. And so after the interface, I'm going to come in and put in a set of curly braces, and we're going to say Aquarius ViewController, and we're going to give it a name, and I'm just going to use the same name with a lowercase a. Just kind of helps make the naming convention a little easier to remember. So now we can refer to this as Aquarius ViewController in our implementation file and tell it to load that when the button is clicked. So let's go in and just do just that. I'm going to take this IB action that was created, and I'm just going to move it up to the beginning just so that it's a little easier to see in the video view. So what we want to have happen is when the button is tapped, we want it to load this Aquarius ViewController nib file. So we're going to start by saying the name of the ViewController, and we have to allocate it and initialize it into memory. And to initialize it, we're going to init with nib name, and the nib name is Aquarius ViewController, and the bundle is nil. So we just put that into memory, and now we can display it or add what's called the SelfView. So we say SelfView, add SelfView, and the name of the view that we're adding is the Aquarius ViewController view. So let's save that and see if it will run in the simulator. Okay, so if I tap the first button, then it does indeed load our second view. Now, the back button hasn't been set up, so let's go in and see how we remove this from the view. So to do that, we need to go into the Aquarius ViewController nib file, and we're going to set up the back button to do a method. So I'm going to go out of the utility panel and into the assistant editor. And I'm just going to right click and drag from my back button into my header file. And we want this to generate an action, and we'll just call this go back and connect. So now we need to go in and wire up this go back in order to remove this view. So let's go into the standard editor and into the Aquarius ViewController implementation file. And again, it added this action at the bottom. I'm just going to move it up to the top. And what we essentially want to do is we want to remove this from the view. This is sort of like a deck of cards, and when the view was added, it was added on top of our original view. So to remove this from the view, we say SelfView, remove from SuperView. So now let's try that and see if it runs and will remove itself. So we open up the view and we hit back, and it takes us back again. All right, so we have our navigation working back and forth between two different views. Okay, let's set up one more. Let's do the Aries ViewController because we are going to need to make some adjustments in how it decides which view to load. Okay, right now in our ViewController implementation file, it's connected to just when the Aquarius button is tapped, but we're going to have up to 12 different buttons using this same method. So let's build another ViewController for Aries. I'll just right click on the Constellations folder this time and new file, Objective-C class, next, and I'm going to call this Aries. Make sure it's UI ViewController, no targeted for iPad, and we do want a nib file for the user interface. So next, I'm going to click Create to put them into our existing files. And again, I'm just going to drag them up so that they're up here with the rest of them. Now, I'm not going to take a lot of time to set up this view. I'll show you a quick technique, since this potentially could be 12 different screens that are all pretty much the same. I can come in here and let me select all of these, and I'm going to copy it, and I'll go to the Aries ViewController nib file, and I'm going to paste. Let me change the background color, and I'll change the text, and I can quickly change my image to Aries. Okay, so we've added a third view, and again, our ViewController header file needs to know about this, so we have to go into the ViewController header file. We're going to import it in. We're going to create an instance of the Aries ViewController. Now, to set up our implementation file, all right, the buttons are connected to this same method. So when we had one button, it was okay. Now we could go in and we could create a different method for each button, and that would work fine. So you could have Go Aries, Go Aquarius, and have this code in there. But this is a good time to introduce the concept or the idea of working with switch statements in Objective-C. We could have a series of if statements to say, you know, if the Aquarius button was tapped, then do this, and if the Aries button was tapped, to load the Aries ViewController. But what would work well here is a switch statement. So let me put in the basic format for a switch statement. So here is a basic switch statement. So we have switch and a value in here, and then the different cases of what we want it to do. So I have a case in here for case 1 to load Aquarius, case 2 to load Aries, and this should be case 3 to load Cancer. Now there's an error here, and that's because this isn't completely set up with the right variables and values yet. But this is what a basic switch statement looks like. And so what we want to do is set this up so that depending on which button was tapped, it's going to execute one of these cases. And what we're going to do is to use a tag value. Now, a switch statement requires an integer as opposed to a text string. So let's look at how we get information about our button that could be an integer. I'm going to switch back to the ViewController nib file and click on my first button here for Aquarius. And over on the Attributes panel, if you scroll down, there's a section in here where we have a tag. And I'm going to assign a unique tag number to each button in here. So I'm going to say tag 1 is for Aquarius, tag 2 is for Aries, and then tag 3 is for Cancer. Now we can get the value of this tag and be able to run a switch statement. So here is how we get information about our button that was the sender. We can say UI button, and we're going to give it a name. I'll just call it the button, and that's equal to the UI button sender. And we assigned a tag number to each button. So I'm going to create an integer called tag, and that's equal to the button tag. Now we'll be able to use that integer in here to determine which case to run. And just to double check so that we can see what's going on, let's say we're going to do a log statement and we want a digit in there, so we'll do $D, and we want it to replace that $D with the tag value. So now let's run this in the simulator and see that when we tap the button, we should get a log statement that says the tag number and also if it matches up with one of these cases. So if I tap our first one for Aquarius, right, we have, it goes to the Aquarius screen, we have that set up, but we also can see that it says load Aquarius, and it did do the print the tag number. So I'll move this out of the way. So first it was doing a log statement for the tag number, which is here, and it also went to the case to print out our log statement to load Aquarius. Now you might say, well, why is this loading? Because we only had this in the case 1, but the code is still down here from the original method. So what I want to do is I want to move that code into that switch statement or that case statement. So now if I rerun this in the simulator, we should make sure this still works. right? And it does go back. And now when we do Aries, it does show Aries 2, load Aries, and 3 to load Cancer. So in the same way that we did the Aquarius, I'm going to copy this and put this into the case 2. And instead of Aquarius, we can just change this to Aries. Okay, and so let's see if it loads in our Aries view. So here's Aries. Now I haven't set up the back button there, but it's going to be the same way that we did it in the Aquarius view controller. So I'm going to go to the Aries view controller nib file, go into the assistant editor. We need to set up our back button with an action. We'll say go back. Go into the implementation file and set up our go back and say SelfView, remove from SuperView. And we'll try rerunning it again just to make sure that those do go back and forth. Okay, and then Cancer hasn't set up with another set of view controllers, but from these two, you should be able to get the idea of how to set up the additional ones. Now the other thing, we do need to set up our own memory management with this. At the beginning, we didn't select automatic reference counting, so we do need to account for our memory. Let's go in and be good memory citizens and clean up our memory. So I'm going to go into the ViewController implementation file. Right in here, we are allocating into memory the Aquarius view controller as well as the Aries view controller. So we need to manage the memory of those. Anything that you allocate and initialize into memory, if you're not using the automatic reference counting, then you do need to deallocate them from memory. So I'm just going to go to the end of my code here, right before the closing end sign symbol, and put in a void dealloc method. This is where we deallocate memory. And we'll say we have our Aries view controller and we want to release. And the same thing for the Aquarius. And then we can do a super dealloc. So to complete this out, we would have a view controller header, a view controller implementation file, and a view controller nib file for each of the different views that we're adding in. So if we had a different view for each one of these constellations, then we're going to have another set of 3 files, and our view controller header file would have to import each of the header files for the other ones. And we would also need to create an instance of the view controller in here so that our header file will be able to connect to them, just like we've done with this to allocate it into memory and then add it to the view. Now each of these cases is going along with the tag name. Again, when we went into the view controller nib, right, we selected the button and gave it a tag number so that we could use that in our switch statement. And let me just quickly show you another way to add on to this. If case 1 and case 2 and case 3 doesn't make a lot of sense to you, when you're looking at this, you might want to say, well, case is Aquarius, case is Aries, case is Cancer. We can come up and we can define some constants. So let's say define Aquarius, and we'll say that's 1, and define Aries, and that'll be 2, and then define Cancer as 3. So then down here, instead of case 1, we can say Aquarius, Aries, and Cancer by using these constants. So now if I run this one last time, this still works. And then this time it'll only display, we don't have a separate view controller set up for that, so it will just display our long statements. So you don't have to change these with constant values. This just might be helpful if it's easier for you to go back and quickly see something more meaningful than just a number value. So those are some techniques for being able to create and add view controllers and then link out to those different view controllers and then link back.